It's hard not to feel like the Romantic period is uh, uniquely filled with, extraordinary genius level talent. Um, I mean, I don't know how you exactly measure those things, but it just seems uncanny the prodigious productivity, especially among young people in Romantic period literature. I don't know why that is exactly. I mean, one factor certainly was revolutionary context. The pot was just getting stirred in terms of upheavals, social organization, and philosophy and communications technology, and industrial technology, class mixing. These key romantics like Mary Wollstonecraft and John Keats came from working class backgrounds, very marginalized. And I think although Romanticism is aligned with a kind of aristocratic perspective, as by art, by necessity was, I think, in general, up to that point, relying on patronage. So Romanticism does represent this transition from a kind of feudal arrangement of the art world to the kind of more commercial, uh, market economy for art and literature in the Victorian period. Um, so, but even among this kind of genius, this remarkably large set of geniuses, I think John Keats really stands out. Um, and he's certainly my favorite, I'd have to say. And I think he's sort of considered a Shakespeare level talent in English literature, um, and did so much. Was so prodigiously productive in such a short life. Died at 25. Um, so, really looking forward to jumping into his work. I want to say a little bit more about the position of the second generation romantics. Um, so, I think one way of looking at romanticism in general is in terms of that line from Frankenstein, the moment of Frankenstein's confrontation with the DeLacy family. Now is the time. Um, it's kind of communicates an urgency of now that I guess is related to the revolutionary moment and the potential, a new awareness of the potential of activism, popular uh, movements, social movements. And, popular literature, I think, was one such social movement, and which had to do with not so much political emancipation, but emancipation of the imagination from, institutional religion and, hierarchies of, uh, feudal society. That theme of Blake's of emancipating the imagination has to do with sort of reappropriating mythology and figures of religion, and reclaiming a kind of active, creative, sensuous engagement with um, uh, the old myths, our ancient hero, Don Juan, our ancient friend. Um, uh, so, and, inhabiting this congregation, has to do also like just with the city of London, literary, material culture, the urban literary community. Um, that's to say, romantic poetry is a way of, working out these metaphors, working out who we are by working out these metaphors for ourselves, the people, the friend, um, recognizing these as flexible categories that we decide in the way in which we embody them. So again, this idea that literature teaches out that society is a living text that we are kind of writing as we're participating in it. So one way of looking at the difference between first and second generation romanticism, I think, is in terms of the distinction between place and space. I talked a little bit about the kind of mobile, the global popular culture that romanticism can be seen as anticipating. And I think that this distinction between place and space is helpful for understanding that. Place, democracy is local, wedded to the particular location, locale. Proprietary, individualistic, spectatorial. So there's I don't know. I might suggest there's in Wordsworth we might notice this fetishizing of the place, and it kind of he has these poems like composed on Westminster Bridge that at Tintern Abbey, they're derivative of the place somehow. They're relying on a kind of claim to have been there. Anyways, the value of the poetry is somehow derivative of this particular place. The kind of sacredness of the place. It might be implicitly proprietary. It's not, the same as, owning property, but it's kind of a poetics of ownership in some way. And you can see, obviously, that's a major theme in Frankenstein, the name, the proprietary name, and Pride and Prejudice. Lizzie's falling in love with Pemberley, like that. It's that kind of fetishizing of the place that I think we can notice in Austen as well. That's what I want to point out, a kind of difference in attitude. I think that towards context, it's conceived more as in terms of space, this kind of open, mobile, maybe imaginary, more radically just imaginary, literary space of literary imagination. So, when we get to things like Frankenstein or the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, they discuss geography, but it's from a kind of more uprooted perspective. And, they're figures of wandering across the globe. And same thing with Persuasion. And same thing with Chapman's Homer, which we're about to look at. But first I want to look at the thing Keats is probably most famous for. People that have read none of Keats' poetry might know this letter. So I want to discuss his negative capability letter a little bit in relation to this idea of kind of spatial, mobile, popular culture. So sublimeness, that's sort of what I mean by, imaginary communities. And by the way, what I've been saying here about romantic emphasis on active self-determining communities, that's how they talk about new media now, is active participatory media. So I kind of think I think that's a good way of thinking about what's going on. And a lot of these experimental texts, they're trying to create new media. They're trying to create active readers with these sort of textual experiments, like Frankenstein and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, are novel formats that play with the printing and the context of reading becomes important. Now is the time. And the actual physical dimension of reading. So that's what new media is about, is the active receiver, like you receive community, you participate in new media as actively rather than just receptively. That's such a central theme of Romanticism too, what we half create and half receive, as Wordsworth put it. Okay, so let's see how Keats puts it. This is also a key. Negative capability is a key, I think, distinguishing feature of second generation conception of the sublime. I talked earlier about the kind of comic dimension, and I think Keats's idea of negative capability it is in line. It incorporates, that Byronic comic, or Austen's comic sublime, and it's sort of an enjoyment, more playful kind of sublime, right, as opposed to the more like solemn elegiac sublime of Wordsworth. But it's not, I don't know, it's not evidently comic, but it has a pleasure in sensation that is very rich and very pleasure oriented. So it's very indulgent poetry rather than solemn. So I think, and it's sensational in the way that I was talking about as hysterical before, like the hysterical aspect of popular culture, this sort of enjoyment of a collective body. And that's what he gets at here. This idea of negative capability usually is presented just in the context of this one section of a sentence. And I think that leaves quite a bit of significant context out. So here he presents it in terms that will sound familiar to you, that will just sound a lot like the sublime. Bunch of ideas struck me, and he says, and especially what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean, negative capability. That's when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So that, faith of imagination, faith in imagination, rather than that irritable reaching, that possessiveness, that needing to kind of own and control that is provided by knowledge, or the pretense to knowledge. And he aligns this irritable reaching with Coleridge, who's kind of too eager to understand what his poetry is doing. So what does this leave out? Well, first of all, it leaves out that what made him think of it was not literature but theater. He had gone to performance of Shakespeare by this very famous actor of the time named Kean. So what he's expressing here is a love of theater, and a popular enthusiasm for this particular theatrical experience that this famous actor of the time provided. It a spectacle, a sensational experience, and a public experience, a public feeling. So that's why I think negative capability sounds so kind of sophisticated and highbrow and kind of intellectual and technical, but that's not. I really think that's misguided. I think he's talking about public enthusiasm, and there are other indications here that I think flesh this out. So the excellence of every art is its intensity, capable of making all disagreeables evaporate from their being in close relation with beauty and truth. So what makes an art excellent is that it makes disagreeables evaporate. So it's kind of interesting. Like he's saying that excellent art, you actually expect it to be disagreeable, even repulsive. But if for some reason it isn't, you expect it to be kind of painful or disgusting, but repulsive. But what makes it art is what you expect to be hard turns out to be pleasant. And he contrasts this also, so that gives you an idea of the kind of sensation. It's like a sensation that confuses, surprises your familiar categories of experience. And he contrasts this also, interestingly, with men who say things which make one start without making one feel. And I think that it sounds like people that just provoke, not meaningful sensation, but just sort of empty. It's sort of like Wordsworth's critique, empty stimulation, rather than meaningful feeling. So I think these different dimensions of the context of negative capability kind of flesh it out in an interesting way. I mean, it's almost like he's describing a horror movie. Like it's public. You expect it to be repulsive, but it has an intense. It's an intense sensual experience. It's mysterious, dubious, and recognizing the alignment of negative capability with popular culture is really helpful for understanding Keats's class situation. That he is a working class Cockney poet, and was subject to class prejudice in the extreme, and that really affected his career. He was denigrated for his poetry was denigrated as working class poetry, mocked in print, and uh, even also by Byron, called him a masturbatory poet. The flamboyance, the sensationalism of his poetry was correlated with dubious sexuality, effeminacy, and a kind of soft-mindedness. His education, his intelligence was derided. And that's such an important subtext for how Keats uses mythology. It uses his imagination always has a kind of uses his negative capability, has a kind of class alignment that's really, really special, really powerful. So this is what he's referring to. Keen in his low company, or being derided by his companions. And so this endorsement of Shakespeare is a class endorsement, a kind of an act of class self-consciousness and affirmation. So let's look at Keats's early masterpiece, his first celebrated poem. Has an interesting context to its composition. He wrote it very quickly, without virtually any revisions, on the way home after staying up all night and reading this translation of Homer with a friend. So it's like a memento for that, commemorating that evening that they enjoyed reading this book so much. It's really, really amazing, striking right from the title on first looking into Chapman's Homer. It's commenting directly on this class issue of education. Reading Homer in translation is kind of an admission of not being in first class culture, where the ability to not having a higher education, literary education. Keats was trained for a little while as an apothecary, surgeon assistant, but gave it up after a year or two just to write poetry. So he's celebrating reading a translation, which is kind of an admission of literary fraudulence. That's the key. This admission of inauthenticity is key to Keats's poetics. He even terms it in terms of fanaticism. He's interested precisely in the potential for imagination that's opened up by inauthenticity. That's what negative capability is lacking authority, but enjoying the freedom of kind of deregulation that comes with uh, um, in authenticity. So the thing, what Chapman's Homer offers is freedom to imagine Homer, a bit freedom to imagine the actual Homer, precisely because you're reading an inauthentic copy, inauthentic translation. That is the freedom of imagination, is the freedom of metaphor. Not Homer is a metaphor for Homer. Like, I get to dream about Homer by not having the actual Homer. That's like what I was saying. The people is a metaphor for itself. It has the freedom of imagining itself. That's what it really is the capacity to imagine itself. It's negative capability means being liberated from the sort of dogmatism that a thing is a particular thing, that I just passively know or register, and affirming that that Shelleyan infinite creative power of the imagination. So the other thing to notice right off the top of this poem in the first line is the kind of subtext of money, this correlation of literary prestige with actual money and property. So he begins by aligning the different domains of literature with domains of property, and comparing literary experience or literary knowledge as money. And he builds on this to the point of also likening it to scientific knowledge, gaining kind of currency in or acquisition, property. The astronomer, when a new planet is discovered, it's like a new property or new currency. And then finally, he compares himself to Cortez, like conquering the Americas, looking out over the Pacific. So he makes identifies literature with empire. Ultimately, cash, property, empire. But like his reading of Homer, or celebration of Homer in terms of the translation, this popular repackaging of highbrow art in lowbrow form. Keats likewise is going to characterize Cortez not principally in terms of the actual Cortez, the actual conquest, but a popular dream of the conquest, collective dream, wild surmise. So again, the emphasis on the negative capability, what's just imagined rather than known or possessed. On first looking into Chapman's Homer, much have I traveled in the realms of gold, in many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So I suggested that Keats, you know, that the body of the poem kind of deconstructs its investment in sort of canonical culture, and I suggested that be, uh, the poem likewise um, refers to uh, property and scientific knowledge and money, in order to deconstruct that identification. So why is that a plausible way to read this? Um, well, as the usual reason is that the terms of the identification are unstable and are ironic. Um, so, yeah, just I notice an ironic distinction between Chapman's loud and bold speech and the silence of the wild surmise. The wild surmise is negatively distinguished from explicit speech, even the boldly articulate speech of the poem itself is left in a negative relationship with the wild surmise. We're just left with this image of men in silence looking at each other. It's an image of a collectivity, but the collectivity isn't articulated in the poem. It's a echo of the poem that we're just left to imagine in silence. Also, isn't it interesting how he doesn't he describes hearing Chapman speak out loud and bold, but how does he consume Homer? He breathes him. He breathes his serene. That's so. What do you make of that? I mean, I think it deconstructs the idea of poetry, of property. They say common is air. Like you can't own the air. So Homer is a dream that's in the air, like the wild surmise, available to everybody.